Welcome to the Unfiltered Friends podcast, where we humanize your favorite creators through their personal stories and then learn something from them. I hope you feel inspired by today's guest, and if you do, share it with someone who needs it. So without further ado, here is Unfiltered Friends. Hello, Unfiltered Friends. I feel like OCD is a subject that you hear about, that people frankly overuse improperly. And I wanted to sit down with Phoebe here and have a true understanding of at least her experience of OCD and how it shows up. So without further ado, Phoebe, hello, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. How
Hey.
are you?
Good, good, good. So, I feel like OCD, I hear it so often.
hmm
And I can imagine for someone who has been diagnosed with OCD, hearing people kind of frivolously use it has got to be a little frustrating at times. Is that an accurate statement?
Oh, yes, very accurate. It feels very invalidating a lot of the time.
So I hear "Oh, I'm so OCD, I cleaned a lot today," or "I'm so OCD, things are color coded." Can you
hmm
explain the difference between that OCD and the way OCD shows up for you?
It's called obsessive compulsive disorder for a reason. So, if if you enjoy cleaning because it's like satisfying to you, um, then that can't be OCD because OCD is compulsive for a reason. You feel like you have to complete a compulsion for some kind of reason, and typically that's like fear-based. So fearing that something bad's going to happen to you, something bad is going to happen to a loved one, so for people to say that like, "Oh, I'm so OCD because I just have to have everything clean, straight, and organized," it's like that's not actually what OCD is. Now there is something called I want to say it's obsessive personality disorder. I honestly don't know much about that, but I will say I've heard that typically people who have that more side of OCD, that typically that stems from like obsessive personality disorder versus actual obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, that's not to say that like if someone, seriously suffers with that part of OCD that's any less valid than, my version of OCD. Um but it does typically get taken and used in a way you know, that's not it, creates stigma, misconceptions and stuff.
It doesn't take over the I think the way it's been explained to me is the difference between someone who just enjoys cleaning and someone who has OCD connected to their cleaning is the person who doesn't have OCD connected to it. It doesn't take over their life. It doesn't
Exactly.
impact their well-being. So that would be the way to differentiate between if someone just likes to be clean and someone has OCD connected to cleaning.
Exactly.
So I didn't realize how many different types of OCD, even just doing research, was it cleaning OCD, harm OCD, relationship OCD? How how many types of OCD are there out there that you're aware of?
Oh boy. There's so many. There's gender identity OCD. There's sexual
H-
orientation OCD.
How do you become obsessive compulsive with gender identity?
So I will say that's not one that I experience, but I do experience or have experienced sexual orientation OCD, and um, typically when you have one subtype, you more than most likely have like two to three. That doesn't mean that you have them at one time. That just means that you typically have like a theme going on. So a lot of the people that I talk to with sexual orientation OCD experience gender identity OCD as well. So gender identity OCD, I think there's also another abbreviation for it. Is basically where you are um, obsessing about like if you're, the wrong gender or, um, things like that. So
So how does sexual orientation OCD show up for you? Like what thoughts happen or what actions
yeah,
happen when you
yeah.
have that?
So I'm 23 now. A lot of my OCD, and I wasn't diagnosed until last year. So, but thinking back on it, since I was diagnosed, I can recall moments when when I did have OCD, but I just didn't know it yet. So a lot of my OCD mainly surfaced around 16.
Mhm.
That was also when I started my first, what I call my first real relationship with my now fiance. But so around that age, sexual orientation OCD was one of the first things that I experienced. I couldn't be around anybody of the same gender. I couldn't be around any people part of the LGBTQ plus community. Um, it got to the point to where I couldn't even leave my house simply because I was so scared of being triggered in some way, which how triggers show up for me might not be the case for the next person with sexual orientation OCD. But for me, like I couldn't make eye contact with women. I would be scared that I would somehow find them attractive and that that would secretly mean something about me. And then I would just like spiral into like, what does that mean about me? What does that mean about like who I am? And the point about having a subtype of OCD or having OCD period is that like your obsessions are ego dystonic, meaning they do not align with your core like beliefs and who you are as a person. So, being that I had sexual orientation OCD and also being a young teenager, figuring who I am and like, figuring out my sexual orientation period, there's a lot of pressure on who I am and figuring all that out and to have that on top of that extra stress on top of that, it was a lot. So,
Mhm. I mean, I hear and I know that you actually covered this, so you're versed in it. What you're describing to me, someone who is afraid of even making eye contact with someone of the same gender, it
mhm,
sounds semi-connected to homophobia,
mhm,
meaning just like fear of
yeah.
homosexuals essentially. What's the difference between homophobia and what you experience with sexual orientation OCD?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great question. And often those with sexual orientation OCD or SOOCD is what we commonly call it. Um, we often get, confused for being homophobic. And that's actually quite opposite for us because we love people. We love the LGBTQ. Like I have no issue with anybody part of the LGBTQ, sorry. Um, the I can't really explain in detail the difference because I'm not homophobic. So I'm like, I don't really know
But
why one.
what's
Yeah.
the fear? What is the fear when it comes to that? Can you
The f
identify it?
I would say the fear is that you aren't who you say you are. So it's kinda hard for me to explain, especially to someone who doesn't have OCD.
Yeah.
For those who do have OCD might understand what I'm saying. This can sound controversial, but I'm not meaning it to be at all. So, like, people who are transgender, they feel like they're in the wrong body, right?
Mhm.
I I like to describe sexual orientation OCD kind of feeling similarly. I'm not trying to compare at all. Those are totally like two separate things, and I'm not trying to invalidate either of them, but that's kind of how it feels to have sexual orientation OCD because you feel like your mind, your OCD is trying to tell you these things that like, oh, you are gay because you looked at that person's boobs, or like you are gay because
Mm.
you had like a groanial response that must mean something. And versus when really all of that is ego dystonic, and that's not necessarily going off of like who you really are inside, if that makes any sense at all.
So, like, if you look at someone of the same gender, maybe you find them to be an attractive person, or you're just like looking at them in general, you get these intrusive thoughts that make you question your own sexuality. and then there's an internal turmoil surrounding that. Does that sound accurate?
Exactly.
Mm.
Exactly. And sexual orientation OCD, I do want to say as well, um, it doesn't just involve, you know, someone who is, uh, straight or whatever, fearing being gay. It also includes people who are, lesbian or whatever, afraid of maybe they're actually straight. So, because we used to go by homosexual OCD, but then sexual orientation OCD became a thing, and we use that instead because that's more inclusive and that includes,
Mhm.
every orientation.
Yeah.
So,
Describe to me what an intrusive thought is when it pertains to OCD.
so an intrusive thought is completely unwanted. It's something that typically carries a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety, and it's not something that someone enjoys having. And I know right now, especially on social media and TikTok, there's like a theme where like, oh, I just want to act on my intrusive thoughts, so I'm gonna cut my hair today. Like
Mhm.
that's not intrusive. That's impulsive. Like that's
Okay,
and
yeah.
that can feel so, like what are you talking about? Like, if I acted on my intrusive thoughts, I'd be in jail. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, it's
so
just, like, something you, like, wanna do and decided not to think about it that much versus something you didn't wanna do and you did anyway.
mhm, exactly, and intrusive thoughts are everybody with OCD, I'm sure would agree, is like our intrusive thoughts are nothing we would ever act on, nothing that we would ever want to act on because it's not who we are.
Mhm. Something that you talk about on your page quite often is relationship OCD. Can you describe what relationship OCD is and the intrusive thoughts that happen when you experience it?
Yeah, so relationship OCD is pretty much exactly how it sounds. It's OCD surrounding your relationship, and typically that's my main thing that I experience, and that typically is around like, oh, you know, what if I'm not in love anymore? What if he's not the one? What if I'm meant to discover myself and be single? And
Yeah.
maybe that means I shouldn't be with him. So like, those would be more of like the OCD thoughts that would go along with that.
I mean, like, I was looking at one of them, like, you had some intrusive thoughts that were like, "You don't deserve to be happy, something's wrong with you. You have an
Mhm.
urgency to seek reassurance," but this is something that I also experience quite often. What's the
Yeah.
difference between me experiencing it and you, someone who's diagnosed experiencing
Yeah.
those things?
So everybody has doubts. Everybody, it's completely normal and okay for anyone to have any of these thoughts. However, it kind of goes back to what you said earlier. Like, it's when you become obsessive about it and it controls your life. Like it becomes a cycle. So for OCD, you have the obsession, then you have the compulsion. You need to go into a compulsion in order to relieve that anxiety, and then you will find something else because that's only temporary, because the
Mhm.
compulsions don't do you any good, it does you harm. And then you might get temporary relief by completing a compulsion, and then you just find something else to obsess over, and then the cycle continues.
Yeah.
So everybody can have these thoughts. However, like, sending you into this cycle is what makes it OCD, if that makes sense.
So does it go from, like, you have the obsession and then the compulsion, and it can just be cyclical and happen over and over again?
Exactly. Exactly.
How do you s how do you interrupt that? Like, if somebody is starting to experience that cycle or when you're experiencing that cycle, what do you do to get yourself out of what feels like a pretty harmful and damaging thing?
Mhm. It's a really great question. So it takes a lot of mindful awareness, um, and a lot of practice doing so. So for OCD, the number one treatment or form of treatment for OCD is what is called exposure and response prevention therapy. for short, we typically call it ERP. That's what it is. Um, and so what ERP is you're basically like exposing yourself to your fears, like the fears behind your OCD, and you're sitting with it without completing a compulsion as best to
Mm,
your ability. So
mm,
with that can come a lot of like, like I said, mindfulness and awareness of like, okay, do I really need reassurance right now? Um, can I sit with this discomfort instead of doing so? Because the way that it's looked at is like OCD is a scary movie. And if you're constantly like closing your eyes and avoiding watching the scary movie, that scary movie is always going to be scary to you. However, doing ERP allows you to like, okay, you're moving your hands, you're making yourself watch a scary movie, and then what happens? The scary movie becomes not scary the more that you do it. And the more that
mhm,
you do it, because the scary movie is not scary anymore, that OCD being the scary movie, it dissipates.
mhm. Is there aspects, so I've done quite a bit of therapy. I did mostly like EMDR therapy, so dealing with a lot of trauma. But then I went into cognitive behavioral therapy, which was basically just trying to disrupt my spiral before it happens. I had a habit of a lot of personalization. So I'd make things about me that weren't really about me, and I would have to have presence of mind and questions that I ask myself to disrupt that spiral, because in my experience, at least with what I've gone through, once that spiral gets to a certain point, it's very, very difficult to get out of. Do people with
Mhm.
OCD also have a similar process of disrupting their spiral?
Most definitely. I mean, it's really, really hard, especially in the moment, to disrupt that cycle. Um, it definitely is possible. And that's why I tell people like when you practice ERP therapy, you know, do it imperfectly. Don't expect yourself to do it perfectly or else you're not going to do it right. It's not going to work. You have to allow yourself to do it imperfectly because there's a all or nothing mindset with OCD. We have a very black and white mindset. So that can look like, oh, I have to either do it all the way this way or I have to do it all the way this way. I'm having a really good day, but then something slightly inconvenient happens. That means my entire day's messed up. Like it's all
Mhm.
bad. So that's why I like to tell people, do practice ERP therapy imperfectly because that'll allow you to like be kind with yourself and be able to, disrupt that cycle.
Yeah. That's it's literally on my cognitive dissonance homework, the black and white thinking. And you ask, like, for me, there's like a series of questions that I had that I would ask myself in order to like really challenge whether this is a black or white situation. I can imagine it's got to be really frustrating not being able to see shades of gray in that.
Mhm.
Is
Yeah.
is OCD a lifetime thing? Like that's forever going to be with you, or is it something that you can? I don't know. I don't want to say curable. I don't know how to
Yeah.
say this question, but like, is it forever?
I completely hear the question you're trying to ask. Unfortunately, there's not a cure for OCD, at least
Hmm.
not yet. But basically, there's maintenance. So that's what ERP
Mm,
therapy is for. And we even do CBT therapy, like you're talking about as well. ERP and CBT are quite similar. I
hmm.
don't know much about CBT though, so I can't really speak on that part of it. Um, but yeah, so those are used for maintenance. It more so, of course, depends on the person because we aren't a one size fits all, and that's what I like to say a lot. Um, and for example, like me, even though I've had sexual orientation OCD, I don't really have it anymore because I did ERP. Because I forced myself to keep my eyes open and watch the scary movie, that subtype has no effect over me anymore because I it doesn't scare me
Mm,
anymore. So
mm,
that's how I kind of look at it. Like I like to say, at least me personally, I will always have OCD, however, my perception of it will change. So,
mm,
like, a common OCD subtype is postpartum OCD. which obviously occurs after one has a child. And, you know, I'm scared as a woman to have a child because I'm afraid that I might develop that subtype, but I can't know because that hasn't happened yet. So that very well might be something, because we are constantly growing, we're constantly evolving. That might be something that I will experience, but the subtypes that I have right now might go away as I, continue facing them, I guess you could
Mm-hmm.
say.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully
So
that
it's just
answered
like
your
a
question some.
yeah. Well, it's just I think it's like a lot of other things where like this is just how you show up in the world and you find the healthiest way to navigate with
Yeah,
who you are, you know? It's not who you
yeah.
are, it's an aspect of who you are.
Exactly,
Um
like, you can definitely live happily with OCD. I mean, OCD is a very debilitating disorder, but it doesn't have to take your life away, It doesn't have to destroy your life. You can still live a very happy, satisfying life even with it.
mhm. And you got diagnosed pretty recently?
I got diagnosed last January.
Last January.
Mhm.
What did you think was going on with you before your diagnosis? Like, did you have thoughts about like, "Hey, something's going on here." Like, what were those thoughts if you had them?
I honestly just thought it was anxiety because I grew up a very anxious child. Like you, I have a lot of trauma as well. um still that I'm still working through, of course. But yeah, I just thought it was anxiety. I would have like periods of time where I would I laugh with my fiance about it. Like, I look like I'm seizing up on the floor sometimes because I will be in such a awful state of mind where I feel so out of control mentally and physically that, like, I'm just rocking myself. I'm just,
Yeah.
like, pacing back and forth. So I've had moments like that since childhood, and so I always just figured that it was just anxiety. And for years I saw talk therapists, and I remember before COVID, I even asked my therapist about OCD, and he asked me like 5 questions. He was like, "Okay, if you move the remote and someone moves it, but that's not where you moved it, does that bother you?" I was like, "No." And he was like, "Well, then you don't have OCD." Um, yeah, yeah.
It's like such a limited like, that's what you hear. Like, when you hear OCD, you
Mhm.
think like, "Oh, I clean
Yeah.
a lot,"
Do
or
you wash your
whatever.
hands? Yeah,
I mean, and
yeah.
which is an aspect of a
Yes.
certain type of OCD, but I don't think people I mean, I was today years old when I realized there was so many subtypes. So I'm assuming like and that was one of the thoughts that I had. I was like, "Man, there's so many different types. Maybe it gets a bit confusing, but in reality, it helps really get specific about the things that you experience OCD about." You know, it helps. How does getting that specific help you?
It puts a face to it, really, for
Mm,
me. It makes me feel like l like I have an answer, like I know that
mm.
that it makes it more real. It makes it more, I know. I don't wanna say what's wrong, but, like, it helps me put a face
The thing you're
to what
struggling
feels
with.
like, yeah, to what feels
Yeah.
like the devil in me, like, what feels like a monster, you know?
Yeah. It has to feel sometimes like you're just so out of control, and that's gotta be really frustrating, you know, where you're just like, I like when I have when my battery like we were talking about introversion before, like when my battery is done, I so wish that I could show up for everybody and go out and have a good time. It's just not my reality. And I find myself getting frustrated with not being able to show up how I'd like to or how other people would like me to. Do you face that as well?
Yes, and it can make it even harder because it can make you irritable, it can make you, because, like, you feel so out of control, and nobody can see that when they look at you, like, nobody
Yes.
can see what you're dealing with inside. And so to already be feeling that way, but then have OCD on top of it, it it's rough. It's rough,
Mhm.
and then it's hard on top of that to, like, recently, I'm not sure how if you've seen about it, but recently something got out about like someone had said that OCD was a demon in you. And that was
Mm,
like, wow, to already feel like, OCD is a monster. It feels like a demon. But to say that,
mhm.
people with OCD, that OCD is like a demon within you, like well, like we're possessed. Like we're already fearing that, like, are we possessed? you know?
Yeah.
Then to have like
Is that a
someone
thought that you have, like, that you're possessed?
um it's definitely one that has crossed my mind, but it's not one that I commonly, ruminate over. No.
Yeah. I guess it really just breaks down to wishing you had a bit more control over
Yeah.
yourself.
That is typically entirely what it is. OCD, you at least for me, a lot of it stems from me feeling like I'm out of control. Like, for example, I can't drink alcohol anymore. I I can't
Mm,
drink alcohol. I can't even drink coffee because when I drink coffee it triggers my I'm not too familiar with like harm OCD, but I would imagine that that's what it is. Like I can't be alone. I can't be around like chords even because I'm like, "Oh my god, I'm afraid that I might do something to myself even though I would never do that." That's why it scares me so much because I would never do
mm.
that. So that's why it scares me. So yeah, it's like it feels like OCD took away a lot of that for me.
I was watching a video that you made about you were talking about edibles.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm somebody. I live in Colorado.
Oh, I love
We
Colorado.
It's wonderful here, and I'm a daily weed user. It helps my brain stop because my brain will just, like, keep going. But you were talking about how it's not really an option for you. Did I read
Mm,
that video correctly? And I have a theory, and I want you to tell me if this feels accurate. I've noticed that people, when they feel like they aren't in control, weed will exacerbate that because they don't feel like they're in control of what's happening, and maybe that will escalate your feeling of OCD in that situation. Does that feel accurate to you?
I definitely agree. For me like I don't live in a state where where that is legal. So like Delta 8 is, however. So that's what like
I've never
I
tried it.
really
No, I've
I've
had the
always
real
wondered.
stuff. California, I've been told Delta 8 isn't quite the experience, but
Really?
I have a feeling, though, if you have trouble with Delta 8, that if you had edibles here, that it would be even more so intense of an experience.
I would probably die.
Yeah, let's
No.
not do that. No.
But yeah, so like I've been prior to trying an edible, I was already like using Delta 8 quite frequently to help my anxiety and it was great. It felt like, you know, like is this what it's like to be normal? So just like see a thought pop up in my head, like visualizing a thought popping up in my head and not feeling like I need to react to it versus, when I'm every day I feel like I have to react to it.
Mhm.
So trying that edible, first off, I took way too big of a bite.
That's literally like everybody who has the edible experience does that. They either take too big of a bite or they take too little of a bite and take way more, and then it all kicks in at the
Mm,
same time. I remember sorry, we're gonna tell a weed story for a second. I remember taking way too much, and then I just could not stop laughing to the point where I had to put my head
oh
in
my
the freezer
gosh.
because my head was so hot from laughing, and then the world was spinning, and there's really no getting off
Oh
that
my
ride. It's, like,
gosh.
not a good time, so
That's
don't feel bad. That's
crazy.
everybody has that edible experience, and that's how you learn, but there's an
Yeah.
extra layer for you.
Yeah, I'm like that's why I can't drink anymore is because when I was really drunk one time, I don't even quite remember what triggered me. I think I don't even remember what triggered me, but something triggered me and I think what it was I drank 2 different kinds of alcohols that you're not supposed to drink together or something like that, and so I
Mm,
felt sick, and then whenever I feel sick, it triggers my OCD. That's just how I am. I don't know if that's for everybody else too. And so then that triggered my, cuz like what happens when I feel out of control is my OCD tries working in overdrive to be in control. And
ah,
so that can be really, really difficult for me. So when I
like,
am drunk, you know how like people are like, "Oh, I'm not drunk, like walk in a straight line." Like I even when I first got drunk on my 21st birthday, I told my fiance, I was like, "Watch me walk in a straight line. I'm not drunk." I was very visibly drunk.
yeah,
But that's pretty much how like my OCD works in the long run. It's like, let's like we are in control 100%. Or if you're not in control, what's going on? But anyways, going back to the whole edible
yeah.
thing. Um so I have health OCD. I don't have it as severely as other people might, but it is one of my subtypes. So I know when you eat an edible, it can already make you feel aware of your body, like sensations and, things like
Mhm.
that. So imagine, okay,
Okay.
imagine having health OCD where you're already like focusing on your heartbeat. You're focusing on, you know, internally what could be going on. Like for me, anytime I have a headache, I'm worried it's a brain tumor. Um,
Wow.
yeah, it's hard. And it also makes it hard because it's like I avoid going to the doctors because I don't want to know that it's that it could be a brain tumor, but then it's either I avoid the doctors or I go there too frequently because I want reassurance that it's not something like some crazy, brain tumor or cancer or
So
something.
you could if you ignore it, does your brain let go of it, or does it then obsess over the fact that you don't know?
Oh, I take mental screenshots. That's what I call it.
Mental
If
screenshots.
like even if something like that doesn't bother me in the moment, I like to say I take a mental screenshot, I save it for later.
So you can be upset about it later?
Yep. Yep.
That's awful. Yeah.
Yep.
That's not a
Yeah,
good
it
time.
definitely is. So when I took too much of the edible, I remember like, it hits you at different stages. It like works itself up. So it felt great at first, and then it just kept going. It kept going, and then next thing I knew, my head was spinning. It felt like I could feel my organs moving. Like it felt like I could feel the blood flowing through my heart, and that freaked me out. And like it felt like I could focus on any part of my body and I could feel just that part of my body. So that like completely freaked me out, sent me into a
Mm.
complete spiral. And I remember I told I told my fiance, I was like, "I don't feel good." And then he held me and we watched we watched a Barbie movie. That was so funny. And I just literally kept my eyes shut the entire time until unfortunately it got to the point where I got physically sick because I was so mentally messed up and I just needed it like out of my body. And I actually thought I was gonna die. I thought I was gonna die, but then I was like, I can't tell my parents because they don't know I'm doing this stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was an
I
adventure for sure.
Yeah, when see, everything that you're describing to me is exactly why I enjoy taking edibles. Like, my whole body tingles and I just
Yeah.
release to the experience, but if you have a need
Mhm.
for control over that, I could see that being, like, not a fun
Exactly.
ride.
Exactly. My best friend, I gave it to her because she was the one that got me wanting to try it because she's exactly like you and she likes it for that reason. So I was
Mhm.
like, "Okay, well that sounds amazing," you know? But then no, it was not.
Mm-mm.
Not for me. I was
Mm-mm.
like, I cannot even look at it. I can't even no. It's
Okay.
like
Well,
after you get really yeah.
that's how you
So
learn, you learn what's for you and what's not for you, you know?
yeah, you get really drunk and then you realize, no, Pink Whitney, not for me anymore. Jello shots, goodbye.
Pass on
You
that.
can't look at it anymore.
No, I mean, I'm 41. I can't drink because my body doesn't it takes 3 days to recover, so,
Oh no.
you're probably doing yourself a service by skipping out on that experience. Because when I was 23, it was Yeah,
Oh, no.
like a fish, and it was probably damaging. I saw a video, and I've never, when again, I don't have a whole lot of information before this. This is why I'm talking to you, because I want to educate myself and other people. I saw a video of you at 5 a.m. having an episode, like your mouth was chattering, you were shivering. That is a result of OCD. Can you explain
Mhm.
what happened there?
So, I don't recall what sent me into the spiral other than it was, like, an argument that I had with my partner. Oh, yeah, it was an argument that I had with my partner, and in that moment, I felt so, like, disappointed in him and disgusted by our relationship that I actually felt okay with not being with him, and that's completely a complete valid response to have to an argument. But in that moment, because I felt okay with it, that sent my relationship OCD into like, "Oh my god, does that mean that you finally found your truth, blah blah blah." And so then that sent me into like a panic, which then led to that spiral, that video that you saw because and when I get to that point, I literally this is every time I have to tire myself out to the point mentally where I literally just, like, fall asleep. I will be up until, like, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning sometimes just literally, like I look like I'm just not even there because I'm not. I'm not. It feels like the
Mhm.
OCD just takes over sometimes, and it will look very scary, and I'm so glad that my fiancé he's amazing for being able to look at me like that and still think that I'm great.
Yeah. I mean, how do you know if it's your relationship OCD or it's just like a legitimate thought that you're having? Like, it's gotta
Mhm.
be a little confusing to know which is like, for me, I don't know whether it's my trauma speaking or being informed speaking. So how do you know the difference between this is OCD or this is a legitimate thing that I need to focus on?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It kind of depends on where that's kind of stemming from because if it's coming from like an OCD needing to have an 100% answer, like it goes back to the black and white that I was talking about before.
Mm.
If it's stemming from that urgency, then you're not gonna get an answer for it. You're not gonna find an answer for it because it's not there. So with that, it's mainly accepting the possibility that it could be either or it could be both, and nobody likes to hear that it could be both.
Mhm.
So for me, like that argument was very eye-opening for me in my relationship because I was like, we have things to work on. Like that argument wasn't okay, but the OCD took it and, like, ran with it, even though, like,
Mm.
that was an example of something that did actually need to be worked on. So it's kind of like it's kinda hard to answer a question like that because with when it comes to OCD, there isn't really of course, if it's an abusive situation, that's completely different. However, like, if it's not, it's kinda hard to answer that question because there's no certainty with OCD.
You just have to
You
decide to
just have to
stay in it and
Mhm,
go through with it, I
exactly, you
guess.
just have to sit with and accept the possibility, and that sounds
That
really
sounds
hard.
it's tiring and also terrifying, like that
Yeah,
I
and
yeah.
when people talk about, "Oh, well, what if it's my intuition? What if it's my gut?" People with OCD, or at least me specifically, I can't listen to my gut because my gut will misfire. It's not a reliable source for me.
How do you trust yourself then? Ever?
I trust my values.
Hmm. Can you elaborate on that? What does that mean?
I So for me, that would mean like it's like my end goal. What do I like? It's kind of hard to explain. I've never had someone ask me that. It's like
Mhm.
what I choose to perceive, I guess, about myself or, you know, whatever situation. So I can choose to like either, you know, let the OCD take it and run with it, or I can choose to, like, that's not me. That's not, you know, that's not who I am, and listen to my values. Like, for example, something I recently came out about on my social media was that I suffer with pedophilia OCD. And it was really hard for me to open up about that because that sounds terrifying, right?
What is that?
Pedophilia OCD is basically where you are obsessing over the fear of, like, if you could be a pedophile, or, having pedophilia, like, thoughts, like that, and it's really hard to talk about because it's a really taboo, like,
Yes.
subtype to have, you know?
Mhm.
So going back to, you know, my values, I can have this thought and be like, "Oh, you're attracted to that child," and be like, "No, I care so much about children. I love children to the point to where, like, I know that's my value. So I'm gonna listen to my value, and I'm not
Mm.
gonna listen to the OCD," if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's, I mean, what was the word that you used to say that it's not, the thought is not like who you are? What was the
Mhm.
term that you used at the beginning of the interview? I forget what it was called.
It's not a core value, is that what?
No, there was like a term that you used that said that like the thought doesn't match like what you
Oh,
truly want.
it's ego dystonic.
So that would be an example of an ego dystonic thought where like you're worried about it being a possibility, but you've never actually had those thoughts. Does that feel accurate?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's God, that's
Yeah.
it almost I'm like I'm having majorly like empathetic feelings right now where it's just like I can't imagine how tough it has to be to
Yeah.
not be able to literally trust anything that you think, know when it's gonna happen, how it's gonna be triggered. I mean, like, that's gotta be so massively exhausting, especially because the thoughts that you're having aren't even matching the desires that you have. Like,
Exactly.
I
So
I
then you have cups where, like, or products that companies push out and be like, "Oh, I'm," what was one? It was like, "I'm so OCD," but then it said obsessive cup disorder because Stanley Cups are huge right now. So, like, or I'm so OCD, obsessive Christmas disorder. And so it's really hard to see companies pushing products like that because then, like you said, like, we're over here like, OCD is not fun. It's not quirky. It's not
no.
something I enjoy having.
Mm,
It kills me every day. It affects my life every day. So
yeah.
to see people promoting those products or pushing those products, like, company wise, it's like feels super invalidating.
Yeah. Man, that's got yeah, I can imagine that's gotta be very difficult to witness. So you have been with your current partner for 7 years? Did I do the math right on that? 7
Yep.
years, you guys are engaged. How does OCD affect your romantic relationship?
Well, for starters, I'm a very bad perfectionist. I'm a very
Oh,
bad
yeah.
perfectionist with myself. So typically, when you're a perfectionist with yourself and you like to control your surroundings, because that, at least for me, that helps me feel more in control, of myself mentally if I have my physical surroundings in control, if that makes sense. So typically, the biggest factor is I feel like I have to control him and how he does things because it has to be how I do things in order for it to be correct. So that's a big way. It also affects, my sex life. It can make it really hard to enjoy sex, to even desire it, because like, for me, my OCD is mostly mental. So a lot of my compulsions involve mentally checking myself, which would be like checking myself for feelings, checking myself for arousal even. So it can make it really hard, to be intimate because you can be so busy like, am I actually enjoying this? Do I actually love him? Is this actually, you know, am I doing this because for the right reason? So
Mm,
I'd say those are like the biggest things that, or how it affects me still.
mhm. How does your fiancé show up for you when you're experiencing those moments? Like, what are the ways, say someone is listening to this and their partner is struggling with some form of OCD, how do they best show up for you?
So the biggest one is just educating themselves on OCD. Like we were talking earlier, my he knows me so well that he can look at me and know what's going on. So or know when I'm triggered or know when I need to like step away or something like that. For example, we were at a restaurant. We were at a buffet restaurant and it got so busy and I was focusing on like my OCD was um really triggered at that time and I remember I was focusing so much on like do we look like a happy couple because there were so many couples and I felt like all of them were looking at me somehow. And so I was like feeling a unconscious need to compare and like do we look happy? Do we look in love to other people? Um blah blah blah. And so I remember like we were holding hands. He was sitting across from me and I just like disassociated and he looked at me and he told me after we left because he got me out of there. He knew we had to leave. And he told me, he's like, I saw
Mhm.
it just click in your head that you just because like 1 second I was looking so in love with him, I guess is the way he worded it. And then I looked away, I disassociated, I came back and I looked at him like a stranger, apparently. And that hurt because like I know when that happens sometimes and I try so hard to like to prevent him from seeing that, but because he knows me so well, he's caught on. He's caught on, he's too
Mhm.
smart. Um,
Yeah.
but what was the I'm sorry, I completely went off track.
Yeah, it's how do people, like you say, educate
Oh,
yourself? Like, how do people
yeah.
show up for people with OCD?
Yeah, so the education, of course, is very important. Like, the more that the spouse will be able to educate themselves on the OCD cycle, educating themselves on what is my spouse's like triggers. For example, it could be like checking to make sure the stove is off, checking to make sure the front door is locked, um, and knowing not to encourage the OCD cycle. So that can be like reassuring them. Reassurance seeking is a very common compulsion. Um, telling them like, for example, a hidden way of, like, seeking reassurance can even be, like, saying something and being like and reading their reaction for reassurance. I do that a
Mm.
lot. It's a very
I do
sticky
I do
compulsion.
that. It's not compulsive,
Or
I would say, but that's definitely a really common
yeah,
thing for me, and it comes with, maybe more like an anxious attachment.
yeah, or, like, Googling is a very common compulsion for me, so sometimes, like, a way that I'll be like, "Oh, you know what? It won't be a compulsion if I ask him to Google for me," but that's still a compulsion. So him being able to know that that's my goal is to compulse, then he'd be like, "No, I'm not gonna do that for you. No, I'm not gonna give you that reassurance. I love you and I'm here to support you,
Wow.
and I'll hold you, but I'm not gonna encourage the OCD cycle." And it's doing that sometimes and hearing that from him is really hard, but I acknowledge in that moment that, "You know what? You're right. You're right."
So it's just being knowledgeable on moments where he would be enabling you to
Exactly.
be a 'cause, like, I don't know, like, you keep saying things, I was like, "Well, I do that, I do that." Like, I Google because, like, I don't understand why people don't at this point. It's like all the information you could ever need is in your pocket all the time. What's the difference between me Googling for information and you having a compulsion to Google?
So, a compulsion can be anything. It depends on your um it depends on the reason why you're doing it. That can make it a
Like, I'll
compulsion.
Google
So,
something
yeah,
I'm Google something because I want to know the information, but then once I have the
exactly.
information, I put the phone
Exactly.
away. Do you go down like a rabbit hole and like you
Mhm.
Google for a long period of time?
Yeah, so it goes back to like your reason behind it. So, with googling, for example, like you were saying, if I know I can Google something and be satisfied with just one answer, Or, like, if I'm doing it for educational wise, educating myself on something, and I know that I can just, like, read that and be fine, then that's perfectly okay to Google. However, sorry, I'm, like, out of breath.
It's okay.
However, if you are Googling and you have, I call it the OCD urgency. It's, like, sometimes, like, for me, I'll read really quickly because I that's the OCD urgency, like, I need to keep reading, keep scrolling. So if you are
Mm.
unsatisfied with that answer, so it could be like, "Am I in love with my partner?" Okay, you're not just gonna find, like, one answer under that, so you might be like, "How do you know whether you're in love?" Okay. How do you know whether this is toxic, whether that's toxic? So you can, like, it will create one after the other, like, one more question after that, one more question after that, and that's where it's now compulsive because you're like,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, kinda like a rabbit hole. Just keep going, and then you
Exactly.
not sure where you end up. Um, what are the most common misconceptions you hear about OCD?
That you're clean and organized with it, because 'cause I'm
Mhm.
definitely not, that you have to wash your hands a lot or that you're, like, really clean, and of course, like we said in the beginning, that could definitely be all of these can definitely be, like, OCD related. Um, that depending on, like, what the subtype is, like, if we're talking about SOOCD, that would mean that you're in denial, of your, like, your thoughts or, like, you're just in denial of yourself.
Mhm.
Um, or even with relationship OCD that I guess a big part is that you're in denial of, like, you just don't wanna break up, you know, or
Mm.
something like that, or you just don't wanna acknowledge that you're gay or, like, whatever. So, but I think, yeah, the biggest misconception of OCD is that you gotta be clean or organized to have it. You gotta complete physical compulsions in order to have it. Those I think have to be the biggest
Like, turn the
misconceptions.
doorknob 8 times before you leave or,
Flick the light
which
switch 8 times, you know,
yeah,
things like
which
that.
can be
Yeah,
true, but there's
can
so
be.
many different subtypes that
Exactly, and I
it's not
think,
just like OCD is just not one thing, is what you're saying. It's not one thing, it can be so many different things.
yeah, and it can be tiring to explain OCD to people who do think that way because then once I'm like, "Yeah, I have pedophilia OCD," then they're like, "You're freaking crazy." Like,
Yeah.
you're mental, like, you're just crazy. So it can be really exhausting for those of us that do have taboo thoughts, that do have taboo, themes to even wanna, like, spend the energy, saying, "Hey, that's not OCD," like, OCD is being fear of, like, this or that or this or that, because then they just look at you like, "That's not OCD." You
Yeah.
know?
And it's not even the fear, it's not even having, like, when you talk about the pedophilic OCD, it's not fear of having it's fear of having inappropriate thoughts, not having the inappropriate thoughts. So people probably hear that and think that you're thinking that way, but really you're just thinking about thinking that way. Does that feel accurate?
I think so, I think so. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, it's like, you can even, um, I don't know much about, I wanna say this is a subtype, but I don't know what it's called, but it's basically where you have thoughts about your animals too. They can be sexual thoughts, about your animals because you
Mm,
love and care for your animals so much that the OC will basically twist it and make it like something absolutely crazy that you would just never think of.
yeah. I think people
So
treat it like a conscious choice too, which is probably why
exactly,
they
like,
judge. It's like it's not something that you just like you just like, "Oh, I wanna think about this today." It's, "I have no choice but to think about this today."
exactly.
Yeah. You talked about being too much and that you've trained yourself to not be too much. What does that mean?
I think that goes back to what made me start masking because growing up, I've like I said earlier, I've always been an anxious child. I would always have these episodes even as a child. So I'd always be told that like I'm either being too loud or I'm being too quiet. So, growing up, I created this coping mechanism where I'm like, I just mimic. I'm a chameleon. I say I chameleonify myself because I like just reflect what people want to see from me. So that's kind of what I meant there by like, I be too much. I'm too much sometimes.
Something I always say to people, OCD or not, is if someone says that you're too much, they just mean for them. They don't mean in general. They're just, first of
Yeah.
all, they should be keeping that to themselves. Just excuse yourself. There's no need to bring someone down. But so how does someone with OCD mask when they're having maybe a tough moment?
I believe it would be them trying to create a version of themselves that they would imagine would be normal to them.
Mm.
That can look different for anybody, really, just based on what they view normal to be.
So what would you do to mask in that situation?
I think it definitely depends on like the energy in the room. Um, like even the way that I verbally speak can be different compared to
Mhm.
like one person to the other. Like that's another way that I mask. Um, yeah.
There was a girl I had on the podcast who is she talks about autism, and the way she would describe it was almost like her mask was an amalgamation of things that she saw around her. So even the way she would dress or a reaction somebody had, it was like a combination. It seems like this is a common behavior in order to fit in from people who are not neurotypical across the board.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, I'm not diagnosed, but I've always wondered if I could be under the spectrum in that way. Um,
I mean, there's so much
so
overlapping between,
mhm.
ADHD, autism, OCD, any of these
Yeah.
what do people call it? Neurospicy
Yeah.
diagnosis, like
Yeah.
it seems like there is so many bits of overlap. How do you tell the difference? Do you just focus on the main ones or do you just get diagnosed with all of it? It's got to be really confusing.
Yeah, and it can make it hard to even want to seek help, to want
Mhm.
to even seek answers because like it took me so long to get diagnosed with OCD and that's all that I'm right as of right now diagnosed with. Um, so it's like to even think about trying to get diagnosed with other things, it's like even possibly. It's like why try? Why
Mhm.
try?
Well, it also seems like the diagnosis surrounding a lot of these things in women is so much further behind than those diagnoses in men. Do you know why that is?
I guess I couldn't really say. I mean, I feel like the way the world is today, at least the US, I can't really speak for other countries, but I feel like a lot of people are more so I feel like the world is more so built for men,
Mhm. I
in
mean,
my
it's definitely
opinion, it feels
patriarchal
like.
society for sure,
Yeah, so
for sure.
that's the only thing that I would really think on that, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that sucks. Um,
I
I
think we're
have
getting better though.
100%. I mean, I've been involved with those sorts of discussions for a very long time. I've used my social media for advocacy for a long time, and it is getting better, but I just think I mean, I'm the very beginning of the millennial generation, and I can attest to the fact that the conversations around these invisible ailments um, was not a thing, when I was younger. And the older the generations get, the less help that they have for that sort of thing. So it has been pretty beautiful watching your generation
Yeah,
come forward and like really normalize these conversations. But science is going to take way longer to catch up with
yeah.
those things. Plus, our healthcare system is
Oh my gosh.
just just a
Yeah,
disaster because you can't
that's a
get
whole
help
other
for
conversation.
anything. There's
Mhm.
like I knew someone whose job was to literally figure out how to not cover somebody. And when I went to find health insurance, finding health insurance with good mental health coverage was supremely difficult because they just don't take it seriously. And I'm not sure why that
Yeah.
is, and I wish them the best on their journey. I'm gonna
Yeah.
leave. I'm going somewhere else. Forget this.
Right. I definitely want to say though that like I feel like there are struggles that women more so have, and there are struggles that men more so have. Like my
Hmm.
fiance, for example, he suffers with clinical depression. So there's like, and I feel like there's a unconscious. I don't know the right word for what I'm thinking, what I'm trying to put into words, but like men have to be strong all the time. Men can't
Yeah,
show their emotions. Things
that's
like that I feel like are more acceptable for women. So in that way, I definitely want to say that it's not just like, oh, it's all about men,
I really do
versus
appreciate
women, but
you saying that. You're basically highlighting an example of how the patriarchy also harms men, and I
exactly,
hope that conversation that's as someone who's a more sensitive person who's been very public about sharing his mental health journey, it's extremely validating. So I really appreciate
exactly.
you saying that.
Yeah, it's really important. It's important for everybody, and I feel like if our country were to care just more about mental health, then we
Mhm.
would be so much better off. We would just everyone would be a lot healthier in my opinion, I think it but
Mhm.
but I think like you said, even though I'm I'm 23, I when I was 16, there was no information on like OCD or anything to describe what I was feeling. I had no help. I was by myself figuring all this stuff out on my own. So now, having a community, having a place where I now talk about my experiences with OCD and how I've gotten to this point, and watching all these people just like, say like, "Oh, I've been struggling with it for a month and you've been so helpful." And I'm like, "That's amazing because I went years with no help." So
Yeah.
knowing that like now we've reached a point where at least mental health is starting to,
Mhm.
become more popular, I'm I'm just amazed, and it's so beautiful to me to even see how far my cat in the background
Your cat's
to
just been
see
doing its thing the whole time, just having a party back there, but
I got
making
one under the
biscuits.
blanket too. Yeah, but to see to see, it get to even where it is today, even though there's so much more improvement needed, it's wonderful.
Mhm. It's gonna be a slow process. We got a lot of things to dismantle here.
Yep.
I
I
have a
definitely agree.
I have a few questions from my Patreon supporters if you're down to answer those.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so if you guys ever want to ask questions to guests that I have on, patreon.com/unfilteredfriends. Um, Yvonne wants to know, do you ever think things that will help you cope with OCD will be turned into new rituals that will feed your OCD?
I mean, definitely. Meditation can be a wonderful thing, but then that can turn into a compulsion. Like I said earlier, everything can turn into a compulsion if you really try hard enough. It all depends on what your goal is behind what you're
Mhm.
doing. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
How do you differentiate though? Like you can't trust yourself. So how do you differentiate it? Just do it?
You just do it scared, man. You
Do it
just like
scared. If
you
you
do
take
it scared,
anything
you do
away
it
from this,
unsure.
I
Do
think
it
that's
scared.
yeah, I think that's are tattoos ever a compulsion?
That's a great question. I
Cuz
got this one.
look, I I just got my whole sleeve like redone yesterday. I'm
uh,
in a lot of pain right now, but
oh, I
like
bet.
I can imagine someone who has a compulsion for
It's
tattoos, like
awesome.
they just have got to be head to toe.
For me, I actually spoke about this on my TikTok when I got this one right here. It says stronger than I was, and I got it for mental health. And I got it on impulse. I didn't really think much about it, and when I got it, like I wasn't quite sure where I was gonna put it. I wanted my tattoo artist to decide because like she does it for a living, so So
Mhm.
I I left feeling I left feeling confident at first, but then, like, I doubted the whole because like, OCD is nicknamed a doubting disorder. So then, like,
Mm.
even now having this tattoo can be hard because I'm like, I felt like I was a changed person. I wasn't the person I was because I got a tattoo, and it's so stupid, but, like, that's how it felt. Exactly. So,
I'm
like,
like exhausted hearing
change
that.
yeah. So, like, change can be very, very difficult for someone with
Mm,
OCD because of that.
mm, mm. Hallie asks, what is the line between supporting someone through OCD and enabling negative behaviors?
I love that question.
I got smart people.
I love that. Um, I think it kinda goes back to, you know, I wanna say, like, the end goal again, but enabling someone in a way that could continue the OCD cycle, like, you know, Googling for them or closing the door, that would be that would definitely be enabling. But, like, supporting them in a way I'm sorry, I'm, like, really trying to figure out how to answer that question.
So, can I give an example that might help you?
Yes, please.
So, I dated somebody who had an anxiety disorder. And something that I made sure to do with her is when she was in a good place, she wasn't like suffering with her anxiety. That was when I asked her, what are the best ways for me to be there for you in those moments? And I just educated myself on the best way to show up from her and her personal experiences while she was in a good state of mind to give me an answer. So maybe with you, it would be you would educate them on what those behaviors look like for you, and they learn as they go what is a behavior that you are trying to stay away from and what is a way of just supporting you. Maybe that?
I definitely agree that thank you for for taking what I was trying to say and
Yeah.
helping me with that. That really helped me a lot. I think, for me, that reminds me of, like, any time that I 'cause self-reassurance is definitely can be a compulsion, but what I meant to say was reassurance is one of my biggest ones, so when I'm, like, in a cycle, um, for example, like, my health OCD has been like, a little spiked lately. My themes would just, like when I don't feel triggered with one, it's like my OC has a team meeting upstairs and they're like, "Okay, what will trigger her today? This one? This one's not working? Okay, let's try this one." It's
Mhm.
like yeah. So, being that my health OCD has been spiked more, um, freaking out about, like, how my heart like, I've had some, like, muscle cramps, so I'll be freaking out like, "Oh my god, is this a heart attack?" And then I would just go on and go on and go on and talk about, like, "But I've had this happen today, and then at lunch I had this happen," and I'd be, saying all this to my partner, but then after I'd be like, "Don't reassure me, like, don't say anything, just listen," and that's a way that he is able to, like, support me without enabling it, if that makes sense.
That's something I had to learn just in general as a man in partnerships is men tend to be solution based, and a lot of times women just want you to listen. So I
Mhm.
learned the phrase, do you want to vent or do you want solutions? And I allow them to
Yes.
tell me so that I know what mode they are in because you won't just know. So
Mhm.
I think it's really just about you understanding your diagnosis, you understanding your categories, communicating that to your partner, and just educating them as much as possible so that they can best
Exactly.
show up for you. Because
Exactly, we're not
I
a
can
one size fits
identify.
all. Yeah.
Yeah, I can identify when something is happening, and I'll kind of like it's kind of like that. Yeah, you ever see that TikTok trend where the girl is like, "I want a divorce," and he's like, "Uh-huh, so what do you want?"
What do you
Chicken
wanna eat?
chicken delight. She's like, "Yeah," and all of a sudden it calms down, so he was able to identify
Mhm.
that what she was saying wasn't really what she meant and redirect the energy to what the solution would be for her.
Yeah, that's, like, my life all the time is he'll even be like, "Is this a moment where you need me just listen, or is this a moment where, you want solution?" Like you were saying, like or
Yeah,
he'll be like, "Is this your OCD speaking, or is this" So,
and I'm sure there's gonna be times where you don't have an answer for that.
yeah, I mean, there's times where I'm like, "I don't know, I just know that it feels completely scrambled up in
Mhm.
my head."
So just be a
So,
safe space, like, understand
yeah,
what that looks like for whoever you're interacting with.
exactly.
Yeah. That's
Exactly.
just good partnership. Give your fiance a high five. He seems like a really decent dude. You got a
I
good
will.
one.
He's amazing. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So if people are inspired by you and like want to reach out to you, where's the best place for them to do that?
So I have a TikTok and it's Phoebe Lou.
Hmm.
That's where you'll see me most. I also have an Instagram, same thing. And then I do have a podcast called the Overly Obsessed Podcast where I just pretty much treat it like a diary. I talk about my life, talk about my struggles, things that come up that I'm facing. So that's definitely another one. But yeah,
Yeah. Well, thanks for being on. Thank you for educating me. It's been majorly eye-opening. I'm gonna have to take a nap after this because I can't even
me
imagine
too.
how hard that is to yeah, to deal with on a
Yeah.
daily basis. But you seem to do it successfully, and then you use your platform to help others. So thank you for
Yeah.
doing that.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me on. And I most importantly want to just thank you for treating me like I'm human throughout this whole entire conversation that we've had because it can OCD can carry a lot of guilt and carry a lot of shame. So it's not something easy to talk about. So thank you for creating
Yeah.
a safe space for not just me, but for clearly many other people as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for saying that.